Hello. In episode 127 of Airs for Architecture, I spoke with Dr. Tanzil Shafique, lecturer and author of the forthcoming City of Desire, an urban biography of the largest slum in Bangladesh, which is coming out with Bloomsbury in November.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm lucky today to be talking to Dr. Tanzil Shafique. Tanzil, before you introduce yourself, we'll be talking about your book City of Desire, an urban biography of the largest slum in Bangladesh, which is coming out very shortly with Bloomsbury. But could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, everyone. This is Tanzil. I teach at the University of Sheffield School of Architecture and Landscape, and also I run an outreach program called Just Urban, which does a lot of urban design related outreach and activist work in global South countries.
Ah, I see. And where did you study architecture? Where did you do your undergrad and postgrad?
So, yeah, it's quite a bit of explanation there. So I did my undergrad in Bangladesh in BRAC University, and then I moved on and I moved to the United States. I did my MArch in upstate New York in a very small school called Rensselaer Polytechnic, and then from there I was teaching at the University of Arkansas in southern United States for a couple of years, and then I moved to Australia to do my PhD in urban design. And that's when the encounter with the informal settlements began. I mean, academically.
Yeah, academically. So we'll get onto this in a second, but that's the sort of your introduction to the book is it fair to say, slow self-realization of your intimate day-to-day knowledge of informality in your life in Bangladesh?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one can hardly escape, a lot of the visible informalities. I mean, I say that with the notion that informality exists in all cities. But of course, the visible manifestations in the form of settlements, in the form of street trading, in the form of transportation, they're quite visually present and experientially present when you get on with your life in global South cities such as Dhaka, which is, just to set the context, which is a city of around officially 22 million people. So within that, official figures would be somewhat around 4.5 million people living in informal settlements. So you start to get an idea of the scale at which informality operates in a city like that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, this book comes off the back of your PhD research. And before we were recording, you said you recorded with Kim Dovey, who I did a recording with a year or so ago about his recent book on the Global Atlas of Informal Settlement. But what was your trajectory into this book? Why, I suppose, and this is a slightly difficult question to ask an author, why do you think this book is an important addition at this moment?
Right. I think you bundled up quite a few questions in there. So, I mean,
it's my USP, by the way. I just
right.
Not intentionally.
No, of course. I mean, I think that allows me to sort of unpack things a bit. So yeah. I might just go off on a rant.
Okay.
So, it's a full disclosure. So I think if I sort of like look at the trajectory, as I said, I mean, I did my PhD in urban design, in which I actually went back to my home country, in my hometown. But the book starts with a contradiction. And the contradiction is very simply that while I was doing my undergrad in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, I had to take a rickshaw, the tricycle, human pedal tricycle that you see in global South cities. And usually I took it from my home to my university across this settlement that I eventually ended up studying. So for 5 years, I was taking this shortcut. And, the idea is that if I went through the settlement, it would take much less time rather than if I took the main streets, actually, the traffic is terrible. So actually, to avoid the traffic, I went through that. So in my undergrad architecture school, we're being taught, let's say, very modernist architectural principles. We are looking at, ville reduce and sort of like unit de habitation and then, all of this very modernist housing projects and which is pitted against informal settlements. In a way, there is a subliminal messaging that these people who sort of build their own houses, build their own settlement, this is not good enough as architecture, and this is not good enough as a city. So essentially, when the government comes and evicts them, the architects would swoop in and then design, beautiful apartment complex, apartment buildings, and everything would be all right. So, on the other hand, I mean, against this narrative, my everyday experience of going through that informal settlement, I didn't really find the level of criminality that was supposed to be inside. I saw somewhat of a very, yes, congested, yes, open drains, yes, not as healthy as one would like, but still, you could sense that there were people living, building, and there was a sense of conviviality. So it's not exactly how it was portrayed in order to sort of allow that middle class imagination to take hold of an slum that needs to be eradicated. So it's sort of like this contradiction, one coming from my experience, everyday experience and exposure, and the other sort of like this academic discourse in which, we were okay with this erasure, after which we were supposed to design beautiful buildings in which, if people, and then the idea was that, of course, if the architecture looked great, surely the city is doing great. So I would say that this contradiction was quite strongly, residing in me. And as I mentioned, then when I moved and I was working in, very rural towns in the United States, this contradiction between what architecture was teaching in its studios and what really poor American towns were experiencing, there was a discord, a dissonance even there. So this idea that you'd have like architects who would who a small town could never afford a big architect actually to come and do a project in that small town. So I was working for University of Arkansas Community Design Center, and I was actually working with very rural town halls with whom we were doing government funded urban design projects. But that's also sort of like the second step in my self-realization journey, where I said there is a discord between the way mainstream architecture often projects urban poverty, the way it projects what people end up doing with lack of resource in points of scarcity. So all of that sort of ended up in a way when I I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to do a PhD at Melbourne with Kim Dovey, and I just sort of went for something that was very deep in my heart, which was to go back to my hometown and then do a very deep case study of that one settlement for my PhD. So, it was just going back full circle.
It's really, really interesting. It's a really interesting journey. And it is a beautifully written book, actually. So all credit to you for that. Sometimes, dare I say it, PhDs turned into books can be a little bit PhD-ish. But this feels very much like a kind of distinct and an elegant discussion in its own right. Kind of interested in this idea.
I mean, can I just interrupt? Sorry.
Yeah.
So it's just a small anecdote that this is actually written during the PhD, but this is not coming out of the PhD, as in this is not the dissertation. So the way that the story goes, the book is written as a series of anthropological sort of journalistic notes that I compiled, and then I wrote as a series of 11 nonfiction stories about the settlement, which I then submitted to my PhD committee in Melbourne. And then I was enthusiastically told that I'm not following the academic discourse the way that it's written. This is all great, and I should publish it once I'm done with my PhD, but this is not a PhD write-up. So I was asked to submit a PhD chapter written in a proper academic way. So I kept it aside for 2 years, in which I finished my PhD, submitted my thesis, which also, if I may, boast a little, was awarded sort of like the best PhD in Melbourne that year. But then, so I went back, dug this manuscript up, and I said, I'm going to rework on this because this is speaking at a level that I want to communicate architectural and urban thoughts, which oftentimes in academic discourse, it becomes quite for the lack of a better word, quite dry and quite jargonistic. So this is, which is why I wanted to make it clear that this is not a PhD that was turned into a book. This is sort of out of which the PhD actually was drawn from.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there goes the anecdote.
There you go. Thank you. That's nice. It's nice to clear, and very impressive to write two PhDs alongside each other. The mind boggles. Anyway, place I want to start talking about your book is this very particular form of writing about a global phenomenon and a huge word, informality. But you write about it from the perspective of a very specific thing. Now, I'd quite like to understand that, because obviously I think for people who are accustomed to, even marginally accustomed to discourse around informality, it's this kind of structural discourse which runs at the level of supranational policy. It has these kinds of terms within it which are universal, informality being one of them. And yet what you've decided to do is approach this from the perspective of, as you say, one specific community. Could you explain a little bit why you chose to do that? What was the kind of philosophy? And I suppose, without wishing to get into politics, what's the politic behind that?
I mean, you rightly picked out this. I mean, of course, in my PhD, there is a chapter on methodology, and then there is a bit where I do like an academic discussion of the merits of doing a case study. But of course, there are, as a valid research methodology, this idea of a case study. But I don't want to get into that because I think ontologically there are questions that I'm trying to answer, which is not how I put it in the methodology. So, as you said, rightly said, that the discourse on informality often would, it would have like this idea of a neoliberal political economy, and it would be seen as a structural issue. So, famous books like Mike Davis, for example, The Planet of Slums, that came out in 2004. It's a great book, but at the same time, I thought that Mike Davis did a disservice in the sense that the moment that you start using statistics, there is a lack of recognition of difference, because and in my book, even by the end of it, I try to even get to the point that there is no homogeneous slum dweller. There is no sort of stereotypical singular slum dweller who is repeated. I mean, there are all sorts of stratifications and differentiations. So of course, this idea of difference is quite crucial, because I mean, I have been working with Kim Dovey for a long time. We are both heavily influenced by Deleuze and Guattari. This idea of difference in kind is something that is absolutely crucial for us. And oftentimes, at a structural discourse, things become quite reductive. And oftentimes, for the sake of making that structural argument, you need to let go of lived experience. So I thought, how about, there are a great number of great informal studies that is done as comparative studies. Also, there are great studies that are done based on a singular discipline. So someone might just go into many different informal settlements, but only look at, let's say, the architecture of it, or let's say the sociology of it. So I thought the intensity of my research should come from a very, very fluid, multidisciplinary perspective, where I go into one settlement, but then I bring an arsenal of methodologies from architecture, urban design, planning, sociology, anthropology, and then try it out to understand that one settlement, so to speak. Which is why you would see that the book, the way that it's developed into table of contents, it starts off talking about the sociology of things. Then it goes and talks about sort of like architectural aspects, housing, and then streets. But then it also talks about governance and tenure. So it was more of this query that I had, that all of the structural things that I was reading in literature, how does it get manifested in material terms in everyday lives? So that's sort of like that sort of guided that entire investigation of trying to understand things from an lived experience, a lived reality. So yes, in the book there is discussion about how, let's say, neoliberal economies meant Dhaka was became the headquarter of ready-made garment sector. So there was a lot of factories for which there was a lot of rural migrants coming into the city. That's all well and good, but we really don't understand how a rural migrant gets to build one rural migrant gets to build a three-story house as opposed to one who is still renting. So how do you understand those differences at a very ground level? So I would say that there is a lack of understanding at that very grounded level from a very interior perspective. So the book tries to fill that void in that entire discourse. Yes, I'd frame it that way.
Yeah, I can see that as well. One thing I didn't notice reading through it is your, and again, excuse me if this sounds naive or clumsy, but there's a much greater use of Global South scholars in the positioning of this approach to writing about this kind of informality issue. I suppose issue is not necessarily the right word given what you've said, which I think is really fascinating. Is there some aspect here also of trying to decenter that discourse around informal settlements because it comes from a sort of Western epistemology, which is not capable necessarily of encountering and uncovering that lived experiences you've talked about in an informal settlement like Korail?
I mean, that's a great question. So I'll start it again with another anecdote. So I shall not name that editor, but this is an editor of a very well-known urban studies journal, and then he commented on his 26 years of being editor somewhere. He said, oftentimes global North scholars, they will make quite universal claims, even if the study is in a small town in Minnesota, and then even if a global South scholar has been working for 30 years across 10 different cities, they will still write a paper that's very empirically framed, and there is no grand claims made. And then the claim to knowledge, so there's, of course, he was commenting on this politics of claim making in knowledge production. So, of course, a lot of the great scholarship in Global South that is being done there often is actually hidden away in and it's not purposefully hidden away. It's just the way that since they don't make grand claims, they just remain as empirical registers. So I, of course, and we have been looking at sort of decoloniality and knowledge production for quite a bit now, and there was, in a sense, a very conscious desire to sort of bring together a lot of these scholarship and how to bring them to the fore. I mean, actually, originally I wanted the subtitle of the book to be said as a Southern biography. But I mean, of course, there are difference of opinions when one deals with marketing.
That's right, yeah. I don't think many people realize that books are almost entirely titled by algorithmic search engines.
Absolutely. So
it's so depressing. So depressing.
It is depressing, but I mean, which is why places like this is where this untold stories can actually get some air.
Yeah.
So, which is why. But in the introduction, I do make this point. I mean, the introduction, there is a part where I talk about why this is a Southern biography, and it sort of like moves beyond a very conscious, sort of like a cycle of citation that keeps happening in informality research. And again, this is not to take anything away from the great scholars who are here in Global North. It's taking nothing away from them, but it's just sort of visibilizing discourses that has been minoritized. So it's simply adding to that richness that already exists in the Global North.
Yeah, I think that's a really elegant way of putting it, and it's certainly how it reads. But I'm really interested in this word. You describe it as a Southern biography. I think this is a terrifically elegant idea. It's almost as if you're presenting the place of Karail itself. Is it Karail or Korail?
You would be more correct if you said Korail. Yes.
Korail, okay.
Yes.
This idea of Karail as an active agent, and it almost seems to me that perhaps in the Western modernist knowledge framework, places are things that happen through human agency that we act upon. And you seem to be presenting, and again, correct me if I'm over romanticizing it. I have a tendency towards that. But you seem to be presenting the settlement almost as a co-participant in the production of this everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a lot of discourse now about the more than human, the idea of moving beyond an anthropocentric frame of understanding of cities and geographies. So I think I would put very much in that frame. I mean, while actually coming to this podcast, I was thinking of the work by Karen Barad. Karen writes about sort of, and she has has a way of talking about it, and she talks about mattering. So this idea that Korail as a place is not just a receiver of, so it's not just a backstage on which agencies are played on. And Karen Bard has this idea of an agential turn, or where, interestingly, how all these material things have a sense of social agency. And I think there has been a lot of science and technology studies in which, of course, following sort of Latour's, elegant sort of actor network theory, there has been a lot of talk about how materials matter, but I want to take it up a notch and talking about sort of like at a settlement scale, and how even within a city, how it actively is an agent by itself. So yes, you've picked up, it's I don't really make that claim, because one way that I see is that once you make a claim, then it becomes the onus is on you to prove it for the rest of the book. The book is much more grounded in the sense that by the time you reach the ending of it, you start to perhaps see Korail as a co-facilitator in the production of everyday life rather than a backstage. I mean, actively how people refer to Korail, how people dream about it, how, the story of Korail as the largest informal settlement, how it reaches sort of like the far distances, how it's seen by, diaspora Bangladeshis, who send their money back, remittance. So there is even a very globalized agency that Korail has. And that's not how typically we talk of informal settlements.
No.
So I felt like there is something to be said, actually to be shown rather than to be said. So I don't make that claim explicitly, but I'm glad that you picked it up, and I hope readers pick that up too.
Yeah, my wife makes this point about good writing. Good writing shows you, doesn't tell you. Didactic writing is kind of lumpy and it doesn't really work and it's not persuasive. But the idea of kind of through the agency of the characters within it, and in this case, it's a settlement and the people within it, one comes to understand deeper and more intrinsic meanings. But perhaps you could explain a little bit more about Korail itself. How did it come about? And who lives there? I suppose urbanistically and architecturally, what is it like?
Yes. Well, let's drill down, shall we? So, as I said, a good place to start would be, let's say, the 70s and 80s. Just a bit of a background about Bangladesh. So we declare independence because we were a part of Pakistan following the British Raj departing in 1947. They left with India and Pakistan, and we were East Pakistan. And then in 1971, there was a revolution against the regime, and then we separated. So from then on, Dhaka, which actually was a capital of, the Mughal Empire, the Bengal region. So it has been a city. And then, of course, there was Muslim trade, a lot of trade going on for the last 400 years. So there was a sense of an urban center for the last, let's say, 500 years. So, but of course, in colonial times, it's sort of disregarded as a capital. But since following independence, Dhaka becomes sort of like this alpha city in the country. And, it attracts migrants. Of course, huge levels of migration happen, which is then fueled by the economy opening up, so this becomes highly neoliberal, and then a lot of global capital flows in order to set up garments factories. So, I mean, which is why people right now will walk into Primark or H&M or Zara, and then they'll find a lot of clothes coming from Bangladesh. That is sort of like it started in that 80s. So at the same time, there were a lot of disasters, actually natural disasters, which also sort of like, foreshadowed the climate refugee that we now see. So there was a lot of migration into the cities. Now, the way that the city framed its housing and the way that the city expanded, from the very start, the city had a very colonial way of thinking about the housing for the upper echelons and not the sort of like, not about affordable housing. So from the very beginning, there is a crisis of affordable housing. Now, interestingly, if you were to go and talk to Karail residents who were the first movers, the pioneer settlers, they actually didn't come from the rural areas. So they were already living in some of the formal neighborhoods. But as sort of gentrification started happening, then they couldn't afford the rent anymore. So these people who were already urban, already in Dhaka, they started looking for a place where they could temporarily, pitch a tent or just temporarily be there. So, this is the origin story for Korail was, it's located next to a large government, office, the National Telecommunication Agency. So the the lower class employees, they said, okay, we know what, we're going to find a spot close by where we can pitch a tent so we can still commute, but walk effectively. So it's very quiet, and that's how Asif Bayat talks about a very quiet encroachment of the ordinary.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not a massive revolution. It's not it's not taking over land. It's a very temporary way that they were trying to negotiate their existence in the city. Now there is a fortuitous moment when the land on which Karail sits. So just to give a sense of scale urbanistically, so Karail houses 300,000 people right now at the size of 2 Buckingham palaces. So you can start to imagine, and then it's located urbanistically right in the middle of the city. Now, why would you have that amount of land in the middle of the city empty?
Yeah.
Why would you not, why wouldn't real estate developers? That's the interesting story. So in the 60s, when the government started, getting this land, they were acquiring this land for this large scale nation building projects. They acquired much more land than they needed. And then the story goes that if they didn't need these huge swaths of land for making these government agencies, then they would give it back to the original owners. Now, this is what the government defaulted on. They took the land, but they didn't use it themselves, and then they didn't give it back. So there was a case in the judicial court, and then the judiciary said, "Oh well, this is to be sorted." So there was counterclaims and further claims, and then there is this absolutely formal declaration that no formal use can be allocated here. Hence, you have around 160 or so, 190 acres of land that is right in the middle of the city. It's ripe for development. It's fallow. So it's not really, it's not flooded land. It's quite high quality premium land in the middle of the city, but with an injunction that you cannot build formally. So, those who want to build informally, for them, this was almost like a gift. And then you start seeing that they started at the edges and then it starts to grow inwards. And now after 40 years, so it started in late 80s, early 90s, and then now you have around 300,000 people. And it's completely sort of built in.
And even though it's been incrementally developed, you still notice in your book that there is a certain architectural and urban morphological coherence to the place, which is distinct, of course, because it's informally done, but is not lacking in order or in a sense of order.
Yes, I mean, I think that's when we start to appreciate the plurality of ordering.
What do you mean by the plurality of ordering?
Okay, so I mean, let's say one simple way, let's say Roman cities um, built oftentimes were built on this idea of a grid. And the grid was a simple way of ordering because, you already had the users, you needed to, for the logistical reasons, the grid was the most efficient. But now if you look at cities, for example, Fez in Morocco,
Yeah.
or, these older cities, oftentimes, they're what you'd say organically developed. But that doesn't mean that it didn't have order. It's just a different sort of order. So all I'm saying is that, if you were in Fez, it wouldn't be where you'd be like, oh my God, how did they plan this? I can't find my way. I mean, everyone used it really well, and then it worked beautifully for centuries. So all I'm saying is that if order is a way to make things functional, then these cities, for example, a lot of these older cities, they functioned really well for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely by that, you can deduct that they were ordered. Now, they were ordered quite differently. And this idea that things can be ordered differently is not something that you would find in a modernist ontology, because the modernist ontology by itself, by its definition, it negates other forms. It negates because it needs to put itself as at a teleological head. It needs to show itself as the most progressive form of organization. So from there on, you'd have a very particular way of ordering the city, of planning, that is seen as sort of the only way to do things. And anything else is seen as, something less, something derogatory, something provincial, something old, something traditional. So all I'm saying is that, yes, if you were to look at Korail from afar, and if you were to look at the Google Earth image, or if you were to walk there for the first day, you'd say that, yes, I mean, how do they get about? I mean, there are no clear markings and all of those things. I mean, one would get lost. But it's exactly the same feeling that I had when I was walking in Venice. I mean, I wanted to get lost. I mean, this is one place where I said, I'm not going to go off anywhere. I mean, it's an island, so let me get lost.
Yeah.
And I loved getting lost in it because there were all these things that kept emerging that I couldn't plan. So in a very similar sense, yes, I would say that the argument that I make is this ordering. What I've tried to nail down in my book is, who does this ordering. It's one thing to say that yes, they grow organically, but this is something that I kept finding in the literature. Everyone kept saying this is organic, but what does it mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's used as an euphemism for everything, and it's used as a black box in which you can pack anything and say, yes, that was done organically. It was done bottom up.
Yeah.
What does it mean? Like, who does it? So that's at the core of the book.
Yeah.
Who does things when this city? Who decided the lane is going to be 2 meters? Who decided the house can only go up this much? Who decided? Because if you start seeing repetition, you see repetition of codes in the same way that you see repetition here in England because there is a government regulation. In Karail also, you'll see repetition because people are following some sort of codes.
Yes.
Now, who gets to decide these codes? Who decided them? Because clearly they're not written. There is no town hall. There is no central authority, dictating them. But yet, informally, there is adherence to these codes. They keep changing in the same way that you can apply for variations here. But what is that process of, how did they come up with this forms of regularity, even within that seemingly irregular mess?
It's just a fascinating subject, and it's one I've loved thinking about over the years, because I remember when I first flew into India, and I flew over Dharavi in Mumbai, and I was struck by the blueness. These blue roofs everywhere. And I was thinking, all the buildings are about the same size, and they've so many of them, not all of them, maybe a quarter of them have these bright blue roofs. And it was only when the plane dipped down low enough, I realized it was tarpaulin. And it started to connect some dots in my head, which was that buildings are dictated by tarpaulin sheet sizes, potentially. That could be one of the defining features, but it could also be the length of available poles, scaffold poles, like 21-foot scaffold poles, 7-meter scaffold poles, 6-meter scaffold, or whatever it is. And that there is, as you say, like in a Latourian sense, there is some kind of coherence to this that has to be managed in the same way that we managed formal development, but through informal discourse, informal politics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a bit of a ramble, but the question I've got is, are there parallels here between what you see in Korail and what happens in indigenous settlements, what we call vernacular settlements,
Mm-hmm.
in the country at large? Do people replicate in some way an urban vision of what it is to live like a Bangladeshi?
Yeah.
Do you see
And
what I
that's,
mean?
yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because one key difference architecturally, and I'm going to use a very architectural example for this.
Mm-hmm.
So in the southern part of Karail, when
Yeah.
it was all single story,
Mm-hmm.
so around 96, 97, 98,
Mm-hmm.
second story houses started emerging, and they used a wood frame technique. Now, once this technique was, it was in one neighborhood in the southern part, very slowly, local artisans picked it up, the building construction specialists there, and then it sort of like spread across the entire settlement. So by the time in 2010, you might see second story buildings all across Korail, and no one would say anything particular about that. But when you start to look at the morphogenesis, or sort of like the genesis of that, how it came about, and you start to identify that the second story houses actually came about in a very particular part of Korail that was populated by people migrating from the southern part of the country. Now, Bangladesh by at large, it's a delta, so most of the places people indigenously built with mud. And mud, second story houses in mud is quite rare, but yes, it exists. But towards the southern, the southern part of Bangladesh, it's a coastal region. So there is a lot of buildings with coconut, wood, coconut trees. So there is a lot of particular techniques of, building on stilts, building second floor, because you have tidal surges and sort of like you have a different construction technique. So that got imported because these migrants, when they come with this, latent knowledges and epistemologies of what is architecture, what is urban. So they sort of like imported that knowledge, and then later it spread horizontally. Locals realize that, oh, you get to build one more room on top of your existing one. You don't need to have a, like a 1 meter foundation. You can just so sort of like that started creeping in. And I talk about this as a geographic genealogy. So in the book, I term this a geographic genealogy. So where you came from, what indigenous culture, or sort of what indigenous techniques and tools you were exposed to, these always come with you. And then they're just waiting for a ripe moment in which they get expressed. So Karail becomes like a hotpot of all these different, all this sort of different technologies and knowledges architecturally that gets amalgamated. But probably, as you mentioned, in Karail, the singular homogeneous function is actually coming from the size of metal sheets, industrially produced metal sheets that you get. So, which is sort of like the most common material being used.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in my book, I talk about this, in one part, the unit, the modular unit of the rooms in Karail effectively is 3 meters by 3 meters.
Mm-hmm.
And then, if you dug down, you see the material playing an essential role, because when you buy these metal sheets, they come in a what is called a bund. So it's like it comes in a bund, and one bund translates to sort of like that 3 meter by 3 meter, or like 3 bunds for one room. So if you were to have a room by 4 meter by 4 meter, you'd really be at odds, because you need half an extra bund. So it would be like, it wouldn't make sense. I mean, if you have money, just make one more room and repeat that same purchase order. So it's that unit of production and the unit of selling that is set at an industrial scale, that is set by, let's say, this large industrial, corporations that actually produce the metal sheet. That sort of like gives a sense of order and structure to room sizes. So if someone is rich, they don't have a larger room, they have more rooms. So in Karail, I have been in houses that have, let's say, someone living in 10 rooms with their extended family, and then someone really poor who's living in one room.
Mm-hmm.
But this single room dwelling units, as I call them, effectively it's the same size everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's effectively coming from how the material is sold and the quantification of that. So this is sort of like all this really entanglements of material agency, of industrial scale, that inadvertently impacts a city at the scale of 300,000.
Did you find in your study and in your writing, did you find that the urban form that is produced through this directly affects the sociality of the space itself? And what I mean by that, if that's not clear, is obviously if you've got country people moving to the city, you've got rural to urban migration, but also in inter-urban migration.
Yes.
You're kind of forcing them, and Korail is known as, it's a super dense urban settlement, which has to have a sort of impact upon the way that the society is performed.
Mm-hmm.
There's much less privacy, for example. The fact that all your houses are made out of metal. Oh, and much less privacy, but not only that, but there's much greater chance of fires traveling great distances. There's
Right.
much less possibility in super dense settlements for police activities because they can't get through, and so on and so forth. And I guess that's a bit of a negative side that perhaps we could touch on. But I was just wondering whether you had seen, or whether there was a sense that when people moved to this place, they were incorporated into a new kind of urban culture that was very distinct.
Right. So, I think this is something that we actually talk about in a paper that I wrote with Kim Dovey, where we talk about that the informal settlement is it's not equivalent to a slum. And the point that we wanted to make is, UN Habitat definition talks about slum as houses with particular sets of deficiencies.
Mm-hmm.
So, overcrowding, for example, if you have an overcrowded house, it can be said as a slum. But that's what happens when you have a large gathering. And there are 20 people, and then some of them are staying over in your house, and so essentially, and then Yorkshire water doesn't respond for 3 days, and you're out of water, and technically your house is a slum. As opposed to, so slum is very well tied with living conditions, let's say, as opposed to informal settlements is a mode of production. It's how things are produced. Now they can produce great living outcomes. For example, we make the point that 70% of Istanbul is informally produced in one way or the other, and then right now you'd pay top money to go and pay an Airbnb in an informal part, but now that is formalized. But that was produced informally. But because they had a sense of that this would be formalized down the line, people sort of like kept easements, and they kept wide enough streets because they knew that one day they're gonna get a car.
Yeah.
So it turned out to be quite a middle class informality. So all I want to do for the listeners is to dissociate this picture of informality and slums. The reason that I say that is people in Korail, they often talk about the initial time of Karail being really slummy, to put it mildly, because there were very fewer people, there were not enough provisions, and then they didn't have the negotiating power to, let's say, get electricity, to get water. But then there was this point where the mass increased, and there was a critical mass. There was a lot of local politics coming through, lot of locally led organization. Also, non-government organizations started operating, providing schools, clinics. So there was a moment where, let's say, the density was, single story. So, it wasn't like covering the sun. So each house has a courtyard, and the sun is shining because it's one story. No one is shadowing in no one else's building is putting a shadow in the courtyard. So there was a moment in which the living condition resembled sort of like a densified form of the rural agglomeration. It's just that in the rural settlements, you don't have all the houses next to each other, but you had that here. But since then, in the last 10 years, as that, and I talk about this, as there had been a lot of external financialization of housing production through NGOs, and people started going up, building second story and third story. So what happens when, you have very dense packed houses that suddenly start densifying vertically? Then
Mhm.
you start sort of like depreciating the ventilation, the access to sunlight. So a lot of public health issues started emerging as it densified way too much. So it's sort of like there was a moment where and it's inversely relational to the livability, let's say.
Mhm.
So because there was in some cases no agreement that we should always keep it single storied, uh, and then the idea was that we reach as much as structurally possible, which is, let's say, without a foundation, a house probably can go only up to 3 stories there. So right now it has hit that natural height of a 3-storied structures. But essentially what it has done is it has actually degraded the living conditions,
Mhm.
and you have a lot of, public health issues coming through with it, as well as, of course, the sewage condition, because the number of people is, of course, proportionally tied with the amount of sewage and water and all of that. So I would argue that urbanistically there was a lack of an understanding of what this densification would mean down the line, and that
Mhm.
is one of the drawbacks. And we might touch upon that later when we talk about what sort of ways that these informal settlements can be helped, and what sort of ways that we can actually guide them and help them
Mhm.
understand these challenges. But yeah, we can talk about that then.
Yeah, it's a very interesting, very complicated discourse, particularly from the remove of, Britain, where informality is not really a major thing that we live with in any way. What defines an informal settlement? Because as you've already pointed out, this word slum, which is pejorative to all intents and purposes,
Mhm.
my understanding is that an informal settlement is simply a place in which there is no robust legal tenure. Is that right?
That's one way to put it, but you could have informal settlement in which you have tenure. Now, I will give you an example right there in Korail.
Okay.
So, the northern part of Korail, 1/3 of the settlement actually extends into government land, which, of course, all of this is government land, but what I meant is it extends into the housing area of the National Telecommunication Agency.
Mm-hmm.
So the National Telecommunication Agency, they said to their lower class employees that we have a lot of land around our housing blocks, and you are free to use it to build your own houses. So there is a lot of informal settlement around in that particular area, but they stipulated one particular law. They said you cannot build a second story. So in the northern part, you have these settlements, but the simple condition of the usage rights, let's say, the usage rights, what was negotiated based on the fact that this will never be a permanent structure going up, more than 1 story.
Yeah.
So you have the settlement there planned almost similarly to the rest of Korail. It's planned informally, but and you
Mm-hmm.
have tenure because you have an understanding, a legality. They're not subject to eviction. They're not subject to sort of, so 2/3 of Korail is subject to potential eviction, but that 1/3 which sits within that periphery, within that perimeter of the National Telecommunication Agency housing, they're not subject to eviction. They're not there. They can live there as long as they want. So again, that sort of like uh, probably makes you think differently, because in the sense that they did have tenure in some way,
Mm-hmm.
but then they have produced their settlement informally, which is what the way that I frame it is, um, quite simply, in my head, it's just easier to think of as a way to say that either the government didn't build the houses and the settlement, or it wasn't produced by the capitalist market. So it wasn't any company that was, building, or they were laying out the streets. And so anything else other than that, for me, is informal. So it's quite a wide bracket.
Yeah.
And if I may point out to the listeners, last year there was another book that came out that we co-authored with four others, in Kim Dovey included, in Melbourne. That's called Atlas of Informal Settlements. That also came out of Bloomsbury. And that's a 5-year project that we did where we mapped 51 settlements across 33 cities, in pretty much all the continents. And in that book, we show sort of this plurality of informality, where you have very informal settlements where there is no tenure, the streets are not laid out before, the architecture is informal, the urban design is informal. But you have settlements where, let's say, the government laid out the streets, but for some reason they never really built the housing, and then people went in and built architecture, but its architecture is very informal. So you have settlements in which very formal urban design, but very informal architecture. For example, and we see that a lot in places like in Africa, actually, in Ouagadougou, in Sierra Leone. And so there are instances. I mean, what I'm trying to point to is that there is a lot of complexity to this discourse beyond simply tagging one settlement informal or not. So it doesn't work as a binary, rather maybe as a spectrum or as a field of differences.
Yeah, for sure. I just want to go back. You mentioned Deleuze and Guattari at the beginning, and I was thinking about the way that you were describing the production, the kind of political, I suppose, or policy production and economic forces which produce places like Korail, have produced Korail itself, and this kind of complexity that you're talking about with regards to its development seems to be very similar to notions around a kind of rhizomatic forms, and the network, the idea of network forms over more linear and progressive ideas, modernistic ideas. And I kind of like this idea that there is a kind of inherent and profound complexity. How do you kind of engage with that? How did you go about in your research engaging with all of that kind of noise? It's not a nice, neat project where, there's an architect and there's a client and there's a new technology that's exciting and you look at how the three things interact. Here you've got something that's much more like, well,
a lot of nodes in a rhizome, as you said.
Literally just writing and listening and talking and meeting people and listening again?
Again, so let me go back to another anecdote. So how did I go about this? I mean, first of all, you rightly pointed. I think this is par excellence, this idea of a rhizomatic way of developing a city and rhizomatic way of determining things, where there are many different starts, there are many different actors at the same level. So there is a flat ontology in that sense. And there is a very decentralized, distributed agency that interact with each other, that some of it negate each other, and then some of it comes through. But again, this is not sort of like a Platonic transcendental city that sits outside, that planners and architects sort of like imagine and sort of like try to attempt to meet. So it is much more done on the ground. It's like this great soup that everyone is throwing ingredients in, and then people are negotiating based on what has been thrown already, and then they keep throwing other stuff in it, and some people sort of like extract at the same time. So if that's it's that melting pot, let's say. So how did I go about doing this? As you rightly said, there is no easy way to go about doing this, because I couldn't just walk in and say, can you point me to the town planning office? And and of course, imagine that a lot of this is highly sensitive, right? I mean, who would want to divulge who the political leader making these decisions? You wouldn't want to divulge it, because you become, there is an ethics to it, right? I could be giving all of this information to the government, and then they could be identifying the key people. So, of course, there is an ethics of information exchange here. So, my first month in Karail was me doing nothing. Absolutely. I just went there. I went to this tea stalls, this tea shops, this neat, public spaces, pockets where I spent an awful lot of time. It's just imagine that you go to a small town here, people wouldn't tell you about the local dynamics. But you go there, you sit at a pub every day, and then people become curious, and then you exchange. It's exactly the same logic that I was there from every day, dawn to dusk, and then they kept saying, "Okay, what are you doing?" And then making friends, showing them my life in. At that time, I was living in Australia, showing my house. That to build a sense of parity, to move away from this idea that I'm in this extractivist researcher who's going to come and collect data from you and then go back, make theories, get a good job. Now, interestingly, they told me that I'm the 45th PhD coming out of Korail. So they said, we know exactly what you're going to do. You're going to ask questions, get some survey sheets, ask questions, fill them up, go back, write a PhD, a dissertation, and get a very good job. And I said, I'm not going to do that. Which is why I said, okay, I'm not going to really talk about my research project because I first have to know the local language. I have to understand the local dialect. I need to, even though we speak Bangla, it's a single language, but everyone judges based on how you speak to them.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the first 1 month, I needed to get the pulse. So after that 1 month, it went to the point where one of the local leaders called me one day and said, I thought you were going to do a research project. Can you tell me when you're going to start? And I'm like, yes. And then he's like, okay, we're going to call a community meeting and then I'm going to introduce the research project. I said, okay. So it literally happened where I was sitting by and then, they were introducing the research project because they heard stories about this. So there was a very, and Deleuze talks about this as an intermezzo, right? Starting from the middle. Because Deleuze's point is there is no beginning and there is no end. So one always starts from the middle. And to be okay with starting in the middle. So I started from working with one of these local community organizations. Now, in terms of trying to understand that social complexity, now there is a thing. There is a way that I had actually sequenced it, which is I really didn't understand the social handles, so to speak, of the local's place. So what I did was initially I did a lot of mapping because I said I'm going to look at exactly all the physical things as they are, and I'm because that doesn't need me talking to people to understand the pulse. So I went on documenting every single house, every single sort of like alley in a designated part. Of course, not the entire settlement, that would be impossible. But I chose a very particular part towards the western side. As I was mapping, that 2 months of mapping slowly started revealing a lot of architectural and urban details that raised a lot of questions. So, for example, I mapped all the windows, and then I found out the northern uh, edge had every house had windows, and the southern one, let's say, had in an entire area of 200 meters amongst like after documenting 70 houses, there were only two windows. And uh, and then I started. These were my entry points. These were my, let's say, flights of departure. I mean, in a Deleuzian language, those were lines of departure. The lines of flight. So I said, why one settlement within 200 meters distance? How come one neighborhood has two windows, effectively one window per 40 houses? And how come in the other side you have windows in every houses? So that gave me a lot of clues that started with familiar things that, as an architect, I'm familiar with. So, which is also why I felt my book sort of talks about the sociology of, let's say, material things and architectural things, about a house, about a street, and about an alley, that oftentimes we don't see in sociological discourse. They talk about informal settlements, but they never end up talking about, all the elements, all the architectural elements that make up that city in a very material sense. But none of that has agency to a sociologist. So I was trying to sort of like bring or go to sociology from very material things, as I said. So, one thing led to another. There are many different ways that I engaged. I did a design studio with a local architecture school. that helped me because I could assume the role of a teacher, because that also allowed me to move away from an identity of a researcher. So there was a lot of different ways of mingling, I would say, of engagement, of being there day in day out for a long period of time, which slowly sort of like gave rise to a lot of these insights that I try to capture in the book.
I want to finish on the issue around fixing Korail, because I think we're interested in a way in places like Korail because they represent, even individually, but as a urban typology or perhaps an economic typology, they represent a problem. They represent, in a way, a failure of the system. And I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the idea behind studies of informality are orientated towards solving them. Is that a reasonable thing to say? Is that, in the end,
right,
what the study of informality is? And I guess, what would that fixing look like if it looked like anything at all?
Yes, I think it's about fixing, but I think it's about fixing not just informal settlements. I think it's about fixing cities. I mean, I lived in Melbourne at the time when I was writing this, and then the northern suburbs in Melbourne were expanding exponentially, and and these were soulless, cookie cutter housing that just essentially was based on making profit for companies, and producing architecture that lacked meaning and that lacked sort of. So I would say that the entire urban landscape needs fixing. So there is some parity, but it needs different things, needs different ways of fixing. So in talking about Korail, I don't want to over romanticize. There are a lot of things to fix. As I said, I mean, it went to, everyone started building the second floor and the third floor, and then it became less habitable. And then public health became a problem. And then, they actually filled up a lake to actually reclaim the land. And then there's a lot of pollution, and there are a lot of things that need fixing. Having said that, I mean, I think the traditional way of fixing things has been sort of not seeing it. I mean, there's a great book by James Scott, which is Seeing Like a State. So I think we have always seen this as problems from an outsider's perspective. And when you start to get in and you try to understand all this, the complexity, you see solutions to those problems. Or I particularly prefer the word responses. Responses to these problems and challenges with a completely different set of terminologies. I mean, then you start to see the local differentiations, and you start to see that in Korail there are many different striations, and it only works when you are aware of these striations. So yes, I mean, studies like this will give a lot of insight into how, what are these local internal dynamics, I hope, and then those can help us. So for example, the key finding that I get is, I mean, there is a very strong capitalist class within Korail, people who have been making houses and then selling it them, and then they own 200 to 300 rooms and they rent it. They earn probably like 10,000 pounds a month, but they still live there because they have to keep control of that territory. So, but at the same time, there are people who own 2 rooms and then they rent one and then they live in the other. So, and there is 70% probably living like that. So, how when people go from outside in and they're not aware of these internal differences, they often tend to entrench the existing power structure, and then all the resources end up in the hand of this very few who pose as having nothing. So it's very difficult for you, without understanding the local striations, or the economic striations and the socio-economic striations, of saying that, oh, we just helped a lot of slum dwellers, that we built toilets for them. And in Korail, there are actually a lot of these toilets that are built for this, large landlords who have 200 rooms. And then the NGO comes and builds the toilet, and it's right in the middle of their own territory, serving very few. So without understanding these differences, that's internal differences, it's very difficult to act responsibly and ethically. So that's part one. But the second part that I would like to extend is studies like these of understanding other ways of building cities and other ways of developing urbanism, it can teach us to fix a lot of the issues that we have in formally planned cities. So, a lot of the things, because they're done in a collective manner in Korail, it produces a lot of conviviality. It produces a lot of social relations, a high density of, convivial relations that actually end up helping mental health. So, for example, because you do a lot of things together. So, there are a lot of, I think it's just starting, because I haven't scratched even the surface of this, but I can, from my empirical experience, I have seen that in the southern side of the settlement, the part that I studied, where people were, local, and they built their own houses and helped their neighbors, there was absolute high levels of public space use, high levels of, a lot of high social life. You could sense it. But in the north, where actually these large-scale landlords had actually, built the apartments and sold it off to people, whoever came with money, and the people who are living there now, they don't know each other, they don't know the neighbors, because they just bought an apartment. There, the social life is very different. Architecturally, it's very different, because over there, people build a lot of gates, a lot of exclusion, because you don't trust your neighbor, so you have to build a gate. And in the southern side, where you trust a neighbor, there's a lot of shared spaces, a lot of co-shared facilities, a lot of neighborly relations. So very distinctively, I could sense that in the part where there was a more capitalist production of housing, it was very different, the sociality, as opposed to where things were done in solidarity, in collectivized ways. The social life was very different. And this is within 500 meters of each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel there's a lot to learn as well that we can bring back and into formal planning. A great book actually that comes to mind is Non-Plan by Simon Sadler, I think, and others who edited it, and that talked about sort of like this, the work of more anarchics, and like this anarchist tradition here, even in UK, and in the 70s, and this idea that letting people do things on their own, and receding the formal planning, and letting people decide a lot of things. I think even right now there is a lot of talk about this idea of participatory way of doing things, and I think we can learn a lot about those other ways of doing from informal settlements like Korail. So I think the fixing goes both ways.
That's a perfect point to finish on. Thank you so very much, Tanzil. It was fantastic to hear you talk about your book.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
I write, erase, rewrite, erase again, and then a poppy blooms. So wrote Katsushika Hokusai. I think it's a metaphor for what we just spoke about. Thank you to Tanzil for taking the time to speak with me. It was a real pleasure. And thank you to Bloomsbury for sending me the book. Please see the podcast description for links to Tanzil's professional profile and to the book. And thanks for listening.